You may recall well Hebrews 11, verse 1. There are a couple different translations, but they all come down to something very much like this: an
Right.
assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. So we're back to Hebrews, and chapter 11 is a great turning point. Up through chapter 11, um, the writer of Hebrews, ultimately the Holy Spirit, has been dealing with the question, hey, we've been believers for 20, 30 years. We've suffered tremendously. We've lost homes. We've lost jobs. We've lost relationships with our families. Many of us have been kicked out of our towns. And we all did this because we believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that he's coming back. Well, he hasn't come back yet, and we're still suffering. And so they were being drawn back to Judaism. You know, the law wasn't that bad, and you know, we can just kind of combine in that legalism of Judaism together with our faith, still believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he rose from the dead, but we can do it in a little quieter way so that we're not offending people and so that we're welcomed back. And, you know, you saw some of the craziness of people who, if someone disagrees with them, they shun them at this last election. There were people who couldn't sit at the Thanksgiving table or Christmas get together because somebody had voted for Donald Trump in their family. I mean, it's crazy, uh, but that's emotional. Um, and, you know, something like that on steroids is what was going on in first century post resurrection Israel. And then, of course, you had those Jews who were traveling, who were in the diaspora, who had been spread to other nations of the world, and some were receiving this book as well. And so they couldn't see the results of their faith. They believed, but how long are you supposed to wait? Nothing had happened yet. Now, James talks about the fact that we should count it all joy when we face various trials and temptations or trials and testings, because the testing or tempting of our faith builds perseverance. Faith over the long haul, that's what perseverance is. Faithfulness to God, not just faith. Um, there are a lot of people who can have faith for an instant, faith in a foxhole, and I believe now, Lord, just get me out of this foxhole safely. And then afterwards, they kind of forget that. And there are more than a few. And Jesus talks about in the parable of the sower, where the seed falls, it comes up quickly, and initially, that's indicative of people who receive the gospel with joy, but then they abandon it when the hard times come. And then there's that seed that falls amongst the thorns, and it gets choked off, and there's no fruit. Okay, and so this passage now is the great turning point, and it is addressed to anybody who is going through times of trial and times of suffering, where you're questioning, boy, can I really trust God for this? Can I really believe? It's been a long time now going through these hard times. And so, this verse, if you have not, then uh, if you've not yet memorized it, you know, take it to heart, memorize it, learn it. It's a short verse. It's a verse of encouragement, as is the entire chapter. And the rest of the chapter, he's going to speak about witnesses who give testimony to the fact that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. But a day comes when you see it. This is what the ancients were commended for. Now, Joshua is mentioned in Hebrews 11:30. Well, he's not really mentioned by name, which is kind of interesting. And I believe the reason is that the faith that was necessary to knock down the walls of Jericho was not Joshua's. The faith was the faith of all the people who marched around the walls for 7 days. By faith, we read in Hebrews 11:30, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. Notice it just didn't say, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell. It explained exactly why. For 7 days, the army believed if we follow God, we will be given the victory over Jericho. Now, this is probably the stupidest thing you're going to read in the Bible. Marching around for 7 days, and you would say, well, that's really, how's that going to knock the walls down? But perhaps the stupidest part of this is 7 days. That's not very long. When you were in those days making a siege against a walled city, 7 days was nothing. I mean, that was an infinitesimal portion of the amount of time it was going to take to lay siege. So Joshua believes, and the people believe, that somehow God is going to get them into that city. Now, the gates of Jericho, we read, this is back in Joshua 6, verse 1, were securely barred because of the Israelites. Now, normally they would open them during the day and close them at night. But when they were afraid of an attack, they would be barred. No one went out, no one came in. And then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. Now, wait a second. That says, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. If we go back, we see faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Okay, but God is saying, hey, check this out. Look at those walls of Jericho. Isn't it obvious to you? I have delivered this city into your hands. Now, at the point at which this is spoken, Joshua is speaking to the commander of the Lord's host. And the commander of the Lord's host, the word host is an old English word for army. So the commander of the Lord's army. And what he could say was this one man. And this one man that he is speaking to is also divine, because as Joshua comes closer, he makes it clear that he's walking on holy ground. So who is this? I believe this is Jesus in advance, appearing before his incarnation, a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus Christ. And he appears to Joshua and says, hey, just take a look. I've delivered Jericho into your hands. And that is the key. That is what faith is. It's when it's just the same as if you have seen it with your own eyes. You know, in this world, we talk about seeing is believing. But what this is talking about is believing is seeing, the vision of faith, the eyes of faith. Now, there have been times in my life where I prayed about something and I knew it had happened, even though it hadn't happened yet. Paul writes, he says, pray with thanksgiving. Well, you typically thank people for what you've already received. Well, if you pray with thanksgiving, you're thanking God that you've already received it. I have it because I prayed for it. And I believe now that faith is a gift. Grace is a gift. Everything that we do that pleases God is a gift. So as part of our praying, we need to pray that God might grant us the faith to believe that something that we so desperately want has already happened. That doesn't guarantee it happens at a certain timing. For me, frankly, most things happen at 11:59, when 12 o'clock is the drop dead deadline for something, or maybe sometimes it seems like it's after that. But this message spoken to Joshua is the same one spoken to us. See, I have delivered, and then fill in the blank. In this case, it was Jericho into your hands. But then he continues on, he says, along with its king and its fighting men, march around the city once with all the armed men. Listen, here's the great battle plan, Joshua. Okay, we don't need to gather a council of soldiers to put this together. I'm going to tell you how this is going to work. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this now for 6 days. And Joshua knew the scriptures at that point, those written thus far through Moses, and he knew the world was created in 6 days. Hey, knocking down a very small piece of the world, these walls of Jericho, 6 days, yeah, that sounds like enough time. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the seventh day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Notice that on the seventh day, they make a loud shout, and they also have a long blast on the shofars, having the whole army giving a loud shout. And then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Now, there have been some theologians who've said, okay, what's happened here is this. As they marched around, there were vibrations. This is an army marching. An army marching shakes the ground, which it does. But beyond that, and we don't know how many people were in this army. It could have been 1 million, it could have been a few 100,000, but it was a big number. And so they march around for 7 days. And they do that, we think, they did it potentially in both directions, but they may have done it in one direction. And then they give a shout and a long blast on the trumpets. And so there are those theologians who say, okay, what has happened here is they have created vibrations in the soil, and basically they have created what was necessary for an earthquake. And the shout, the vibrations of the shout basically knocked down a now weakened wall. I suppose that could be, but we don't need a physical calculation of how God has done his miracles, because miracles, by definition, are not part of normal physics. It's God working outside of physics. So if you look at the city itself, it's quite interesting. Hebrews 11:30 again. Remember, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. 7 days. It's just not much time. Well, there were 2 methods of ancient warfare: open field warfare and siege warfare. Cities typically built walls around them, and they didn't build it around the entire city. They built it around a portion so that the arable fields could be farmed, but in times of attack, everyone could gather in the city and be protected by these big walls. You may recall that Nehemiah was desperate to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And until he did that, he ran into problems from Sanballat and all of his henchmen. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult. Also, an interesting thing, it was the bad guys who didn't want the walls. Good guys wanted walls. That's just a little nugget for thought in these days when there are people who seem to want no walls to our nation. The only quick choice when you were battling a walled city was to draw the inhabitants of the walled city out into the open field to fight. Then it was a fair fight. Siege warfare was very, very difficult, and it required massive resources to win. You had to climb these walls that could be 90 feet high. In the case of Jericho, they were likely even higher than that. It was difficult. It was very dangerous, cost many lives. I'm sure you've at some point read about in some of the older fiction, or perhaps seen depicted in the movies. They're climbing up the siege works, these ladders and various things are being thrown on them. The Battle of the Alamo, that was a siege on the Alamo. How did just a relative handful of men keep the city intact for as long as they did from Santa Ana? Well, it was because they were behind a walled city. Walls provide incredible protection. The scriptures say God is our walled city. He is the one who ultimately protects us in life. So siege warfare had very interesting tactics. Typical way was to lay siege by sending wave after wave of men to absolutely certain death to get them over the wall. So they would lean ladders against the wall, and raining down on them would be arrows, would be boiling oil, would be huge boulders, would be all types of things that get knocked off the ladder. They'd die until there was some type of respite, some break in the fighting, and they managed to make it up to the top. And the first few making it over the wall were most certainly killed as well. So when they were battling a walled city, they knew, the soldiers knew, they were facing near certain death. Um, and the people inside the city could have far fewer weapons, could be relatively weak, relatively small. Nonetheless, they could fend off a very large group, a very large army. And while they were climbing up the walls, the attacking army would be trying to break through the gates using battery rams. And all the time, spears, arrows, boiling oil, any number of other things poured down upon the invading army. Well, let me tell you about Jericho's walls. They were 90 feet high and 30 feet wide at the base. You could have chariots go all the way around the wall. You've seen the Great Wall of China perhaps depicted. I was there some years ago, and I was surprised at how wide it was. And of course, the Great Wall of China is massive in length. It is so large that it's one of the very few things on Earth that you can see from the space station. The wall, and you see it something like a wall depicted to the left, but that is actually not a wall. The wall would have looked more like this. Okay, now that doesn't show the width of it, but the wall was quite wide, and certainly 90 feet's a lot. And then when you think about leaning a ladder against it, a 150-foot long ladder or longer was necessary to climb those walls. Very rickety, of course, typically built in the field, very dangerous, very almost impossible to build, actually. So Jericho was going to be a tough one. In all likelihood, they could not have built ladders to attack Jericho. There was no way for them to do siege against Jericho. Now, it took years, normally, siege warfare. So 7 days. Jerusalem was surrounded by Sennacherib for 7 years. You read about King Hezekiah, and Sennacherib has conquered all the rest of Judea, but he can't conquer Jerusalem because it's a walled city. But he surrounds it for 7 years, and he brags that he has Hezekiah shut up in a cage like a bird. Well, he did, but he couldn't capture the city. Ultimately, even after the 7 years, Sennacherib was unsuccessful in breaching the walls. His army was destroyed by the angels, and he went back home, and he was killed by one of his sons. The siege of Ashdod was the longest siege in history. It lasted 29 years, 7 days. Impossible. Impossible to the siege. But then you add on top of that 7 days. Well, at Masada, you may recall Masada, and that's what's depicted to the left there. You had a safe haven hideaway effectively a fortress. The walls, though, are the walls of the mountain, and Herod used that as a place that he could get away to, but ultimately his ultimate place of safety. And in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, there was a group of Jews that fled. I think it was 70 AD was when the destruction happened. Somebody can correct me. I'm not quite certain on the date of Masada. It was then or after. Um, the Romans had no way to build ladders high enough to go the 1,000 feet or so to go up that wall. It was impossible, standard siege warfare. So they built a ramp, and that's what you see depicted there. And it took them 2 years for them to build the ramp. When they got to the top, the inhabitants, rather than be taken captive by the Romans, um, jumped off of the other side of Masada and basically committed suicide to avoid what they knew the Romans would do to them. 7 days, that's a lot of fate. Um, securely barred because of the Israelites, 7 days. But it says, see, look, it's there. Just open your eyes, you can see. Well, they sent 12 spies out 40 years earlier. They could have conquered the land 40 years earlier, but only two of the 12 spies had sight to realize that the land would be given over to them. And now it was the people coming, and the people, all of them, had the sight. They could see that it was going to be delivered to them. And they followed the very unusual instructions that God gave to them. They believed. 40 years earlier, they had not believed. If you read the account in Numbers 13, which is above, which is there to your left, actually, they came back to Moses and Aaron, and this is the 12 spies who've gone into the land, and they have wandered through the land, and they've seen the most incredible things. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. And remember, they brought back clusters of grapes. Why would they bring back clusters of grapes? Well, you can't grow grapes in the wilderness. And grapes were necessary to purify the water because you could ferment the grapes. Actually, they would ferment regardless of whether you intended or not if you left them out long enough. And the alcohol that resulted was used to purify water. That's why water was so precious in the desert, and they had to be certain that any water they saw was not brackish. They called moving water, streams of water, living water, because it was purified. The air purified it as it was ozonated, excuse me, as it traversed its course. And but in the wilderness, that was a rare thing. In fact, it really wasn't in the wilderness. And they were thrilled when they got water out of a rock. And remember how they demanded water. And they went from place where they could have water to place where they have water. But they couldn't do what they had done in Egypt, and they couldn't do what they would be doing in the land of Israel, and that is purify the water with wine. Plato gave the standard formula for purifying water. It was 3 waters to 1 wine. And that's really what the ancients pretty much did. And you found that in Europe. I know my heritage is Italian, and it was not uncommon to add water to wine so that you could drink the water. I mean, generally speaking, it's only fairly recent in humanity's timeline that we have sewer systems, and it's not open sewers in the streets, and it's not polluted water. I mean, if you've seen the Ganges or you've seen some other places around the world, the water is badly polluted. Um, and yet they drink that water. And the way historically that people have been able to drink that polluted water was they would add wine. Well, they gave Moses this account after they showed them all the fruit that they had come back. And remember, it was huge clusters of grapes on these long, basically tree trunks that they carried over. It took several people to carry over their shoulders. We went into the land. By the way, it takes 3 years to cultivate a vine to the point where you can have grapes grow, where there's any fruit. And these people were nomads in the wilderness. So it wasn't just the wilderness nature of it, it was also they typically weren't staying in one place for more than 3 years. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit, very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Anak, the Amalekites live in the Negev. Negev is in the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Okay, so now it's not just one group they'll be fighting. It's these different groups, and some are pretty scary. And the Hittite culture, for a great many years, non-believing theologians thought there were no such thing as Hittites. They never existed. And then they found the tablets at Ebla some decades back. And it was a huge, bustling civilization. And then Caleb, who was one of the 12 spies, Joshua was another. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." He had the eyes of faith. He saw the people there vanquished. He could see it in his mind's eye. He had the faith to believe it, that God could do this. But, and this is horrible, the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are. Well, yes, they were. They were a lot stronger. And plus, there were people who had military experience. They had fought against one another for years. And here was this group coming up from Egypt who had been slaves before going into the wilderness. And then for 40 years in the wilderness, they really hadn't had much fighting until the very end of their time there. It was this almost rabble, I mean, just they weren't a trained army to the same degree. We can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are. And so what they saw was there was no way. Okay, so there's this big walled city we have to get past before we can even begin to attack them. And look, let's just sit down and discuss this amongst ourselves rationally. That's impossible. This is humanly impossible. Even if we had 10 times as many people, it's unlikely that we would be able to destroy a walled city. But the men who had gone up with him said, okay, listen to this again. We can't. And then fill in the blank of what it is that we can't do. With God, all things are possible. There is no can't. There is a won't on our part, and it's quite often followed by a won't believe, but sometimes it's I won't even try. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. Here's the media coming in. Okay, and so this was word of mouth media. Oh yeah, hey, um, Jacob told me this, and Thomas told me this, and so told me this, and it's bad. And of course, this is a huge crowd of people, so they're not getting a firsthand report from the 12, and they probably aren't hearing Caleb and Joshua. Plus, it's 10-2. There's a vote. God lost. And they said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. Well, that may or may not have been true. It says this is the report that spread among the Israelites. You probably played the kids' game of telephone or round robin, where you say something to the person next to you and then they repeat it to the next person. By the time you get to the third person, it's a completely different story. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. The Nephilim go back to Genesis chapter 6. And there was something nearly superhuman about these people, the Nephilim. They were certainly bigger and very powerful. But it adds, they were the men of myths. They were the man of ancient stories. They're the men of ancient stories. And so it was all impossible. The walls, the people, they were settled in. The toughest thing to do was to fight people in their own homeland. You see that where Russia has so much more power militarily than the Ukrainians, and yet the Ukrainians have withstood a great deal of what has been thrown at them. Still very hard. And unless things change, they may at some point lose. But it's not easy for Russia. You saw what happened in the American Revolution. We were guarding our homeland, and a little ragtag band beat the best army in the history of the world up through that point. Okay, so the challenge that the Israelites were facing was massive, and we underestimate how great the challenge was. 10 of the 12 came back with bad reports. The media was against them. And then all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Okay, so just on the report of some spies, they decided it would have been better to stay in Egypt and have died there. Okay, now they're seeing the walls of Jericho, and they were big. They had never seen a walled city like this. This is a generation that had grown up outside Egypt in the wilderness. There were no big buildings. And can you imagine they cross over the Jordan, and to make it worse, it's flood season. They can't go back. So they have the Jordan raging behind them, and they have the walls of Jericho ahead of them. And they believed. They saw in their mind's eye what could happen. And they marched around the city. Joshua saw that God delivers. And he knew it because for 40 years that's what they had learned. They knew the history now of the Jews. Many of the slaves, perhaps they didn't even read. But now, in the wilderness, there was time to read. There was time to talk. There was time to hear the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and hear all of these incredible, incredible stories. God delivered on his promise to Abraham. God delivered on his promise to Moses. God got them out of the land. They heard about the plagues. They didn't live through them. They knew that God had done this. There was no other explanation as to how they'd gotten into the wilderness other than what had happened with the plagues and God's hand. So this was a nation that had time to reflect. And the unbelievers who lived in Egypt, who came out and had something to compare it to, and said, you know what, eating those crummy vegetables and drinking that horrible wine that they gave to us slaves, and working all day long and being beaten and doing such physical labor, hey, that was better than being here in the wilderness. These people didn't say that. They knew the stories and they took hope from them. And it's like us. We know the stories. We know the stories, and we see one after another after another. And in chapter 12, we're told that what we are reading about here in chapter 11 is such a crowd of witnesses. Some try to say, well, when it says that we're surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, it's the idea that the people up in heaven are looking down at us, and it's like the Olympics, and they're cheering us on. That's not what it's talking about. It's just given a list of all of these witnesses from Abel's blood through Abraham and here now Joshua and the Israelites and Isaiah, and it just goes on and on. Rahab, even, who was also here. Um, God delivered by keeping the people alive in the wilderness. Every day they went out and they saw that God could do the impossible. Every day on the ground there was this stuff that just suddenly appeared that they could eat. It was called manna. And it was called manna because that was Hebrew for what is it? Because that's what they saw when they first saw it. What is it? And they ate it. They couldn't explain. Perfect food. It kept them alive and kept them strong. Proper balance for the human body. Boy, I would love to have the formula for manna. Wouldn't that be great? Well, God delivered the Israelites through the Jordan to the promised land. They had just crossed through the Jordan River at flood stage, and they should have drowned. They did not. They had seen the hand of God. They had been delivered in battle. They had just not that long before, they had been delivered in the wilderness. They had been delivered in the raging floods. That's what Joshua saw. And God delivers salvation to us. This is something we can see. At the very moment of Jesus' death, he delivered salvation. We have seen people whose lives have been transformed. We have seen it in ourselves. We have seen his miracles. We have seen his answers to prayer. God delivered on his promise to Adam and Eve. He sent us a Savior. All of history is denominated by Jesus Christ. AD, BC. There was before Christ and there is after the Lord. God delivered on his promise to conquer sin and death, and Jesus rose as a guarantee of that having been done. He rose and he conquered and he provided a way. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Joshua saw even more than what we can see. He saw the tents of the two spies who had gotten into and out of Jericho. And of the 12 men, 2 lived to see this moment when he was here on the verge of taking Jericho. And those 2 men were the men who believed. The men who did not believe were long dead. The tents of Caleb, Joshua, were spared, just as God promised. So promise after promise after promise after promise, God had kept. Most importantly, he saw that God was in the fight. Now, it's interesting when he runs into the angel of the Lord, the commander of the Lord's army, when he runs into Jesus, really the second person of the Trinity, although at that point he wouldn't have known his name. He saw that God was in the fight, and it's interesting. He saw him, and he saw him there, this imposing presence, and he said, "Are you for us or for them? Are you on our side? Or are you on their side?" And the answer is quite telling, because the answer was neither. I'm on God's side. And the real question then was, Joshua, are you on my side? Okay, and that's the question that we have to ask. It's not, is God on my side? A lot of people spend a lot of time praying, God, help me out. Are you with me or not? And that's just the same as Joshua asking that question. But that's not the question. The question is, are you on God's side? Are you someone that he has in his army? That's really the question. The people in his army, the angels, didn't sit on their hands. Joshua now was going to do something important, and his job, in some ways, was a very menial one, not like the other soldiers, the angels in God's army. He was to march around the city, and he was to bring this really stupid battle plan to the people. Okay, they didn't see the angel of the Lord, and yet they believed. You have not seen, yet you believe. And that is the testimony of any believer today. And that was the testimony not many years after Jesus was raised and ascended into heaven. The people who have not seen and yet believe. If God be for us, I love this passage in Romans 8:31, who can be against us? Who is it who stands up to God if God is for us? So we want to be on God's side. That's it. Now we can live our lives focused with our faith just on us, and just, what are you going to do for me? God is a vending machine. You do this, and here's what you get. I want things from God. I want a peaceful life from God. I want good health from God. I want all these other things. That's not the question. The question is, are we on God's side? That was the question asked Joshua. And because Joshua saw what was going to happen to Jericho, he saw it. God said, look, and he did. And he saw it. He had the faith. It was a gift that he had the faith. And so the secret of victorious Christian living is to recognize the battle is not ours, it is God's. In modern America, there is a battle going on, good versus evil. For some people, they think it's Republicans versus Democrats. They think it's liberals versus conservatives. They think it's any number of different things. It is God's battle. And the question is, are we on God's side or not? How do you pick God's side? Well, you take a look and see what the people on his side do. And you determine if that's the side you want to be on. Parents fighting to have control over their own kids so that they learn godly things. You can look at any number of different illustrations of policies that exist. Are you for criminals or against criminals? I know that sounds simplistic, but we've just been reading about judges who are hiding Trinidad members who have done despicable things and protecting them and seeking to get known criminals out of jail. Or some, I won't go on, but you can just read the news, determine for yourself are there two sides and which side do you want to be on. And at any given time in history, anywhere, there will be a group that is most influenced by God. Doesn't mean they're perfect, doesn't mean everybody in it is a believer, doesn't even mean the leader is a believer. But you can determine what good is and what evil is, and you can see God's hand. Now, there are long periods of time where it's hard to see God's hand in any government of any type, but you can see it in people, and you can see it in various situations and know what is right and what is wrong, and seek to honor God with your life and hope in God. And those who hope in the Lord, Isaiah writes, will renew their strength. Now, he was writing in the captivity. They didn't have a democratic government. They didn't vote. They could be killed in a heartbeat. Nehemiah, when he went to stand before the king, Artaxerxes, he knew he shouldn't even open his mouth. If he opened his mouth, he could be killed by the king on a word. The king could just say, put him to death, behead him. John the Baptist, hey, Herod at a feast was influenced by his daughter, was influenced by her mother to just behead John. It wasn't really even what he wanted to do. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. This is another great verse. If you haven't memorized it, Isaiah 40:31. These verses are great to memorize for two reasons. It helps you know where things are in the scriptures. Because if you know this is in Isaiah 40 and you know other things that are in the same area as this, you know, okay, that's what is in that section of Isaiah. And they become bookmarks for us in the Bible. Um, but they are also important, and I think for an even more important reason, in the midst of the trials that you go through, the day-to-day trials, when things get really hard, God is able to bring these verses to your memory. And when he does, it's a word of encouragement. And that's what we're to do, encourage one another. And the means of encouragement is God's scripture and the experience of people in their own lives. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. Which, by the way, when it says that, it means somebody who is weakened, in a weakened condition, who needs strength. They'll renew their strength, who's totally fatigued. They will soar on wings like eagles. Hard to even imagine when you're totally fatigued. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. It's a great verse.